This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, we can talk directly if you enter your comment or question into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and it will show up here in my chat room, and we can have a lovely conversation, which I'm sure we certainly shall. And recently, um, I did a show asking for suggestions of things I might talk about, and I still have that question out there. What would you like to see me talk about in this program? I'm certainly going to continue picking subjects I consider appropriate, but I'd like to know what you would like to hear about. And I've gotten some answers. And tomorrow we're going to start a series on how to read tarot, which was one of the things that was asked about. Today, we're going to talk about Jupiter retrograde, which was also asked about. We're also going to talk a little bit about retrogrades in general. One of the things you may not realize that I also have in my career as a psychic been an astrologer. At one time, I wrote the little astrological guide for Llewellyn back in the early 90s. Hello to Janet in the chat room. So I have a few things I can say about astrology. And I received the following question on Instagram. Good evening, Lord Don. I was just wondering if you might be willing to talk a bit about Jupiter being in retrograde until right around the end of December, and what that might mean for people in an upcoming midday broadcast. I think we all hear a lot about Mercury retrograde, but not the other planets. And when Jupiter goes retrograde, it stays that way for a while. And that question is from Amanda Whaley. And I thought that, yes, we would talk about that. And hello to Othela Jade in the chat room. Hello to Lynn in the chat room. One of the things that happens in astrology is that planets go retrograde um, at various different times. And a retrograde, if you're not familiar with what a retrograde is, it's an optical illusion in which the planet appears to go backwards in its orbital um, cycle. That, of course, is not really happening. Orbits always go forward. The planet does not change its direction, but due to the fact that both the Earth and the planet are in constant motion, for our visual experience, it can seem to go backwards. Most people pay most attention to Mercury retrograde, and hello to Deb in the chat room. But in fact, they all go retrograde. Um, Jupiter goes retrograde, Mercury goes retrograde, Venus goes retrograde, Saturn goes retrograde, Mars goes retrograde. All the classic planets um, have retrogrades that, if you're paying attention to such things, you should pay just as much attention to as any other. What I do want to say about retrogrades before we start, on Jupiter in particular, is that a retrograde has the effect of trying to put you where you need to be in regard to the properties of that particular planet. It doesn't have to do with anything else. It has to do with that particular planet and or anything else that's happening with it. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And hello to Rouge Remedies and lovely Balbert Cour. It's wonderful to see you both. And if you are part of the Wiccan community, you may be familiar with the idea that some people will tend to explode when they have certain points in their career when they are moving up. It's particularly famous for second degree initiations. Sometimes you see it at thirds, and it will tend to have sometimes a catastrophic effect on the person, but not necessarily. But the reason is that all initiations are going to move you to where you need to be at that moment. And the extent to which it is or is not a positive experience depends on the extent to which you resist being put where you need to be. I've known people. I think one of the most dramatic ones was my nephew Jason, who lost his romantic partner, his place to live, and his job within about, I think it was 24 hours of his second degree initiation, and um, and that's because all of these things needed some adjustment, and some of them came back. He ended up reconciling with the romantic partner. They've been together um, for 21 years now. Um, so it's not always an ending, but there can be a need for an adjustment. Um, Retrogrades do the same thing. If there's something that needs adjustment in your life, in the relevance, the imperium of that planet, um, that is what that retrograde is going to do. Now, we were talking about the fact that all of these different planets have their retrogrades. Venus goes retrograde, I believe, every 18 months. Mars goes retrograde least frequently of all of the planets. In the case of Jupiter, it will be retrograde this year from September 4th to December 31st. And it is in the sign of Taurus. And when you deal with retrogrades, it's not just the retrograde that matters, it's also the sign that it's occurring in, it's various other aspects that may be happening regarding that planet. They're all going to have their effects. Astrology is not a simple art. Um, but this Jupiter in retrograde is likely going to be a time of spiritual assessment and reassessment. And the comment was made in the chat room from Rouge Remedies. Doesn't Jupiter deal with finances and business? Well, it can, yes. It also deals with spirituality. It also deals with structure. In this case, I think that we will find the strongest influence in spiritual and philosophical systems with people really looking at what they believe, why they believe it, and perhaps reassessing it. Now, of course, how a retrograde is going to hit you is also influenced by your natal chart, and it won't be the same for everyone. Um, but Jupiter being retrograde in Taurus, as it is here, um, is going to deal with being more flexible in your belief systems, more open in your philosophy. And if you're watching the world at present, you'll notice that there are problems with these things. A lot of people are very inflexible. And this retrograde will be will be focusing on that need for greater flexibility and greater openness. It's been suggested that if certain people missed the lesson of Saturn uh, in Aquarius, which has been a thing recently, that this is in many ways a repeat of some of the same lessons. It's a need for opening. It's a need for evolution. We keep talking about the new age. We keep talking about new developments. Well, that's part of what this particular aspect is dealing with. It's dealing with the opening of closed forms, the broadening of closed minds, so that new things can come in. So when we talk about what we are expecting from Jupiter retrograde, those are the things I would expect. I think you'll see people struggling with their beliefs, and in some cases, evolving them. In other cases, ramming their head against the wall to try to prevent themselves from evolving. But in existence, there's evolution and there's death. Either you evolve or you go extinct. So when the universe says we must evolve, we must open our minds, we must expand our consciousness, that is what must happen. Now, what form it's going to take, how it's going to impact the world, that all remains to be seen. But I think if you look at some of the events going on in the world, you can see why they're forcing people to examine certain things they believe. Um, and really, and I was just talking about how Saturn has been moving through Aquarius in the last couple of years, which has some similar aspects. You can see how that's been an ongoing process for a while now. And it's just going to continue. Now, Brian, hello, Brian, says that astrology is an art and science like baking. Yes, that is a pretty good way to put it. Magic is an art, astrology is a science. Just as cooking is an art, but baking is more of a science. And that's because with baking, you have to pay a lot more attention to some of the rules to get the results that you're pursuing, whereas with cooking you can experiment a lot more. And hello to Michelle in the chat room, who is saying hello from Flemington, New Jersey. Hello, Michelle. Um, I enjoy cooking. I'm not a very good baker um, because, yeah, I like to mess with everything. If I make a recipe, it's not going to be that original recipe. It's going to turn out to be my take on that recipe because I just can't stand to leave it alone. But that's harder to do with baking because things have more precise requirements. Astrology is the same way. There's a lot of room for creativity in astrology, but it does work with a mathematical basis that is not as flexible as many other forms of psychic work. You can be far more flexible with tarot, for example, than with something like astrology or palmistry, which also has a very distinct base. And hello to Amanda in the chat room who says, thank you for discussing this topic. Um, but getting back to Jupiter in retrograde, it is again about confronting our spiritual and philosophical beliefs and evolving them, both as individuals and on a worldly basis. And these things are slow to develop, particularly on a global basis. So I'm sure that it's not going to be the entire process, but we should see some developments in this period. Now, I do want to point out that retrogrades happen for most of these planets at least once a year, sometimes more than once. A couple of them a little bit less often, but not terribly less often. So retrogrades are a normal part of life. They should not be treated with fear. There is no reason for fear. They should not be treated as a pathology because, with Mercury retrograde, it's every few months. You have it several times a year. If you're one of those people who hides under the bed during Mercury in retrograde, you're not going to get a lot done. Hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. I often comment less than favorably upon how many people treat Mercury retrograde. And I've been known to point out that Mercury retrograde is Mercury retrograde, not Murphy retrograde. Does not mean that everything that can go wrong will go wrong. It doesn't even mean that anything will go wrong. It does mean that in matters regarding the planet Mercury and its imperium, things that it rules, extra caution is advisable because if you're not where you need to be in those issues, you're likely to be moved. And again, the more traumatic that is will depend on how much you're cooperating and how much you're resisting. But people treat Mercury retrograde as if it were some kind of cosmic disaster. And they treat it in a superstitious manner. And if you've read my works, you'll know that I am very fond of the saying by Plutarch from his De Superstitione that religious ideas are based on love of deity, and superstition is based on fear of deity. And you can just as easily say love of the universe, fear of the universe, however you want to put it. Um, if you understand what a retrograde is, they actually can be very beneficial. Um, but you must be open and you must be flexible to what is necessary when they occur. And you also have to remember they only affect what they affect. Mercury does not rule everything in the universe. It deals with communication, it can deal with business, it can deal with travel. So it does have a wide imperium. Um, but which of those things um, you want to be cautious of during a Mercury retrograde also depends on what else is going on in that chart. It's not as simple as saying Mercury is retrograde, because we were talking about Jupiter being retrograde in Taurus. Mercury is retrograde somewhere. It has aspects happening to it during that retrograde. It's moving through houses during that retrograde. All of these things influence what's happening. Um, it is not a color by numbers set. And people use it as an excuse for what I think is often bad behavior. Um, Fear of things they don't need to be afraid of, not taking responsibility for things they should be taking responsibility that are not the fault of Mercury retrograde, but are the fault of their not having been sensible during a Mercury retrograde. Um, and I think that the proper thing to do during Mercury retrograde, Jupiter retrograde, Venus retrograde, Mars retrograde, Saturn retrograde, any retrograde, is to simply be sensible and pay attention to what you're doing. And, you really should be doing that all the time, not just in a retrograde. Now, continuing our conversation of retrogrades, there is a huge exception to everything I have just said. And that is because retrogrades happen numerous times. Um, in the case of many of these planets, numerous times in a single year, large numbers of people are born during retrogrades. And if you're born in a retrograde, then it's going to have exactly the opposite effect on you. Another reason that I get so distressed by some of the nonsense I see regarding people's attitudes toward Mercury retrograde, because I know a lot of those people were actually born under Mercury retrograde and just don't know it. And in fact, things should be going more easily for them during the retrograde, because if you were born under it, it's when things will be most normal for you. I was born in Saturn retrograde. And so if Saturn happens to be retrograde, the influences of Saturn are going to work better in my life, because that is my natural state. Someone who is born in Mercury retrograde um, is not going to find it a disturbance. They're actually going to find things will be more straightened out for them during that period in things that Mercury rules. But you never hear anyone say this, even though anyone who's a decent astrologer should know this. Um, but that's not the funny paper kind of astrology that many people like to follow. The biggest thing I would say about retrogrades or any aspect of astrology is that, again, it is a science and it has a lot of complexities. And yes, you can follow sun sign astrology and get things from it. I have found sun sign astrology sometimes very helpful. You can follow little bits of astrology and find them helpful to you. Um, but you need to bear in mind you're only looking at a tiny portion of that picture and not think you're seeing all of it. And this is especially true with something like a retrograde. Um, and I suspect we'll probably talk on some other shows in the future about other aspects of astrology. But I want to thank Amanda for bringing up retrogrades today. And If this were a Mercury retrograde, things you would want to be cautious of if you weren't born under Mercury retrograde would be making sure that you're being sensible in your communications, being careful of contracts, being careful on trips. It's a good time to get lost, particularly if you're prone to that sort of thing. Those are things that Mercury rules. You would not expect it to show up in anything Mercury does not rule. In this current Jupiter retrograde, again, I believe that we're going to find it hitting mostly philosophy and spirituality, but yes, it could hit in business matters. It could potentially hit in financial matters or anything involving growth. Um, a Mercury retrograde is not a good time for things ruled by Mercury unless, again, you're born under it or there are other things going on in that chart. A Jupiter retrograde is not a good time for things ruled by Jupiter unless you were born under a Jupiter retrograde. Um, that also includes government and law. That could also be a place where this may show itself. If we look around the world today, you'll see a lot of things happening in terms of international law, alliances between governments, attitudes toward governments, all of which we would expect to be influenced by a Jupiter retrograde. And in turn, these are influenced by philosophy and religion and spirituality, also part of that Jupiter structure. And as we go forward toward the end of the year, as I recall, it ends on, I believe, December 18th. As we go forward toward the winter solstice, which will be right around then, we're going to see a lot more on these fronts. Some of which, because people are notoriously unwilling to move in these matters, may be quite catastrophic, may be quite shocking in some quarters, and also might not be. It all depends on how people react. Um, when the universe says it's time for change, if you change, things will work out. Of course, they're going to work out no matter what, one way or another, but they'll work out better if you're willing to make the change. If you fight it, um, it's still going to happen. So those are my thoughts on retrogrades. I hope you find them helpful. And again, I want to express my desire for suggestions on things we can talk about. If you have questions, if you have topics you'd like to discuss, please feel free to drop them into the chat room or put them on my pages, and we will talk about them. Some other things we've had ask about. We had some more questions about Corellian ancestors. There were some particular interest expressed in my mother, so perhaps we'll talk some more about her one of these days. Um, and the suggestion was made to talk about tarot, not in itself, but in terms of reading it. And I find that a topic that I think would be interesting. As you know, I'm one of the teachers at Psychic Academy and also at Becoming Witch College. And one of the things I'm teaching currently is Psychic 101, but I'm going to be teaching in greater depth as we go forward. And tarot will certainly be one of the things we talk about. We already have talked about it, actually. Um, but usually when I've had occasion to talk about tarot in the past, I've talked about what it is, kind of generally how you use it, um, its disputed history, but not necessarily how to read it, at least in a program like this. So this week, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the secrets of being a tarot reader. None of which are really secrets, of course, but they might be things you never would have thought of if you had never done it. Because, when you're reading for people, it's a different matter in some ways than just reading for yourself, and very different from simply studying the art. There are certain things that I find it very important to be aware of as a professional reader that I only learned when I became a professional reader and other professional readers told me. And I think it would probably be good to discuss those things. Also, some of the experiences. So, as we go forward this week, our next subject will be how to read tarot. And we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of reading tarot, a little bit about I guess I'll break down and say the ethics of reading tarot because it's a professional matter. I generally am not fond of the term ethics. I think that it's often used in ways that are not constructive. I generally prefer the term morals, but in a professional situation, I would agree that ethics is the right term. Because, the famous example is the lawyer who can be completely ethical and totally immoral at the same moment. Um, but that's a whole other matter. Speaking of things we're watching playing out in the wider community, the um, the standards of the legal profession are very much on display at this moment. Um, and I'm not quite sure what to say about that. I remember, and if you're as old as I am, you will remember the People's Court back in the 1980s. It might even have started in the 1970s with Judge Wapner. And Judge Wapner was an old-fashioned media judge. He was generally patient, wise, exactly who you'd want to have in a courtroom. Look at court TV now, and you've got all kinds of histrionic people who you wouldn't want to have a conversation with. People who have no business being behind a a judge's desk because all they seem interested in doing is handing down exaggerated opinions intended to produce not justice but ratings, which I think is unfortunate, but also unfortunately is a more realistic representation of our legal system. And I think as we're watching the news today, that's very much in evidence also. The wide range of difference in judges from those who are wise and sensible people to those who are narcissists, to those who are downright dangerous and doing things like pulling guns in the middle of courtrooms um, for effect and not for any given reason. So I think that's another interesting, not something that would make a show, but an interesting opinion I'll throw out there. Now, Michelle says, "Could we discuss initiation?" Well, yes, we can. That could be the subject of a show. And Michelle says, "I've been a Wiccan since 1976. I'd like to be initiated so I can rightfully call myself a witch." I don't know. I don't know that you really need that to rightfully call yourself a witch, but that would be part of that show. But we can discuss initiations and what they do and different ideas behind them, and the fact that different traditions have some drastically different points of view on that subject. As a Corellian, I come from the big tent definition, I suppose we would say, and don't tend to be on particularly good terms with the small tent um, understanding. And I ultimately believe initiation comes from deity and it occurs in the heart. But we have ceremonies that can mark your entry into an organization. Um, but a true spiritual initiation, I really think, can only truly happen inside. People on the outside can facilitate it. They're not really the ones doing it. Either deity is doing it or it's not happening. But that's my point of view, and that can be part of that show. So yes, Michelle, we will add initiation to our list of subjects. I'm going to write it down right now, and we will also talk about some of the effects of initiation. We did that a little bit earlier today in working our way into Mercury retrograde, that having an initiation is a little bit like going through a retrograde sometimes. But we'll come back to that in that future program, because now we've reached the end of our half hour. I hope you've enjoyed this show. I want to remind you that if you enjoy my work, you can help to support my work at my Patreon at revdonlewis.com. Um, if you enjoy my writings, you can find them and many others at corellianpublishing.com. And um, if you want to learn more about metaphysics, you can do so at witchschool.com, witchcollege.com, and psychicacademy.co. Um, so with that, I want to thank you, and we'll close with our prayer, as we always do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to remain flexible in our minds and in our personalities as we go through life, knowing that life is change and growth, and that stagnation is death. Help us always to be flexible and supple in our approach to new ideas and new experiences, and to learn those lessons that the universe places before us easily and with grace. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and respect, and knowing you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence now and always. And may you be blessed now and always. And may you be blessed now and always. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again tomorrow.